the East. So let me invite Mr. Hadley and Minister Sikorski up to the stage to join me. And I want to underscore the way that Governor Huntsman, please, Minister Sikorski here, Steve, please. Governor Huntsman began the conference this morning by signaling four key questions that we're trying to tackle today. How do we deter Putin's aggression in Ukraine today, but potentially elsewhere? How do we actually begin to articulate our vision for Europe's East that begins to advance our own values and interests here? How do we avoid a gray zone, a permanent gray zone of instability in the East, which would be a zone of crisis and conflict potentially for years to come? And is it even possible to restore, to remain committed to a vision of a Europe whole free in which Russia can eventually find its peaceful place? So to pick up this conversation, I want to turn to Mr. Hadley, to Steve, who's been working with us quite a bit, not only on the immediate response to Ukraine, but thinking more strategically about the challenge that we face, not only in Europe's East, but Europe. And ask, as a beginning question, how do we deter Mr. Putin without permanently dividing Europe again?
So I think we have to understand that we're in a different space in terms of Europe now. I mean, the whole European project was started 50 years ago to solve a strategic problem in Europe, to find a way to get Europe to move from recurring wars to permanent peace and prosperity. I think we are, and that process then, I think, in terms of EU and NATO and all the rest, in some sense became a little bureaucratic, a little technical. We're now in a situation where I think there is a huge strategic challenge in Europe, partly our internal problems in terms of the EU economically. Part of it, of course, is the challenge from Russian policy, which I think at its most robust would actually seek a division of the EU, certainly a division between and separation of Europe from the United States. And I think if he could do it, show that NATO and NATO Article 5 is not worth the paper it's written on. So I think we have to recognize there is a strategic challenge here that is being presented to Europe, and we need to think a little bit differently and get out of the more bureaucratic and technocratic approaches to these problems. Basically, I think the formula we have to do is we have to be much more active and forceful than we have been in meeting the challenge that Russian policy poses, and to convince President Putin that his strategy is going to fail and puts him and his position at risk. And we need to do that in Ukraine now. It's not because I'm looking for a confrontation with Russia, but what I'm worried about is if he succeeds in Russia and he tries something with respect to the Baltics, then we have the choice that either we're going to risk a war with Russia or showing that NATO's Article 5 is a paper guarantee. And that is either of those outcomes are a bad choice. So I think the formula has to be, we've got to be much more decisive and aggressive and robust in responding to the challenge presented by Russian policy in Ukraine, in order to convince him to change and convince President Putin to change his policy and be willing to contemplate an outcome on Ukraine that avoids the redivision of Europe, that allows Ukrainian people to realize their desire to move west, to become part of Western institutions, but to do so in a way that does not destroy and that would recognize the traditional economic and other ties that Ukraine has with Russia. That is a formulation ultimately to resolve the crisis, to bring some stability, to change Russian policy, to avoid a redivision of Europe, and to get back on the track of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, in which Russia finds its peaceful place. That's still got to be our vision.
Let me just quickly follow up then on you called for a more decisive approach now then in terms of how to deal with Russia and Ukraine. What are the kind of elements that would comprise a more decisive approach than we have today?
It's a pretty long list. I can give you some of them. One, I think, U.S. and NATO need to be present in a permanent basis in places like the Baltics, Poland, and in the Balkans to show Russia that if it moves against those areas, it's going to confront NATO and U.S. troops. I think I support the notion, and I think there are ways it can be done that are not provocative, but I think you need to provide arms to Ukraine and other countries who are threatened by Russian potential subversion in order to strengthen them, and also, quite frankly, not because anybody's going to defeat the Russian army, but to raise the cost if Russia were to try this subversion elsewhere. We obviously have to strengthen Ukraine. Ukraine has to succeed economically. And I think we have to do some things that show President Putin that his strategy is not working. I mean, look, he creates frozen conflicts in Moldova, in Ukraine, in Georgia, so as to freeze those countries in a nether world between the West on one side and Russia on the other. I think we have to make a statement that that is not going to work, that frozen conflicts will not be a bar to those countries ultimately moving and becoming part of the EU, that strategy is not on. It's risky. You know, for everything I am talking about, people will say, oh yes, you'll provoke President Putin. The problem is he hasn't needed our provocations to pursue a policy that threatens our interests. And the time's come, I think, to stand up against those policies. So those are a list of a number of things I think we need to be doing that move beyond where we are currently in our policy.
So that is pretty significant, a permanent presence in the Baltics for our forces, arms to countries like Ukraine, Georgia, strengthening Ukraine a more focused way, and saying that frozen conflicts don't block potential accession to the institutions of the West. Before I get your reaction, Radek, to some of the specifics on that, you have been in this debate, you have been at the forefront of actually helping to think through what an Eastern policy can and should be. Give us a little bit of context for this conversation of what's happening, what is playing out, how do we get here, in the East, and your thoughts on the strategy that we're facing from the Russian side of the equation.
Well, look, first of all, 10 years ago, and until about a year ago, it was possible to imagine credibly that the West and Russia were on a very broad convergence course, that Russia was slowly but surely beginning to accept our rules, joining our institutions. Council of Europe, World Trade Organization, NATO-Russia Council, that we had some interests in common, some disagreements, but broadly, the rules seem to be accepted. And then it changed over the Anschluss of Crimea. And of course, now we seem to be in a different trend in which the props of European security are falling away. CFE, Conventional Forces Europe Treaty, is no longer with us. Budapest Declaration, even earlier, was breached. Russia is considering withdrawing from the Council of Europe. OSCE rules have been violated. And so we face the prospect of either having to accept Russia's rules or live in a world of no rules. And that's, of course, very troubling for the weak, because the strong can take care of themselves. And that's why there is so much concern in my part of the world. I believe that we were right, both the United States and countries like Poland, to have tried the reset with Russia, to have tried to improve relations. And Poland, for its part, did much. We had a group of historians clarifying the facts of history. We created local border traffic agreement, freedom of navigation, cooperative airspace initiative. The churches started the dialogue on reconciliation. It was all going pretty well until President Putin decided to change course. And I agree with Stephen's philosophy, namely that it's weakness that provokes and strength that deters. And that's why we were grateful to President Obama for having agreed for NATO to write, at last, contingency plans for new member states, new after 15 years. And we believe that it was high time at Newport to have decided on a NATO spearhead, which is finally physically coming to exercise in Central Europe. That should send the right signal that the red line is on the NATO border. But of course, that's not enough. Ukraine is a crucial country. And I think the problem, one of the problems we have is a linguistic one. And I don't mean English-Russian. I mean pre-modern and post-modern. When my colleague in my former job, Sergei Lavrov, says in a Serbian newspaper a few days ago that if Ukraine drops neutrality, then further partition will follow. That's pre-modern. We are incapable of speaking such language. And that's why there may be some mixed signals. They may not be hearing what we really mean. I've learned that the Russians are serious people, and they usually mean business. And our problem for the last several years has been that we didn't believe that they really can mean what they're saying. Well, it's time to realize that they do. And it's time for leadership on our side.
Well, let me follow up on that in terms of clarity of language. And what Mr. Hadley, what Steve said as one of your elements was that we actually should be clear on a very difficult issue, that a frozen conflict in your country shouldn't mean that you are permanently kept out of Western institutions. In some respects, this is Putin's long-term insurance policy because he thinks, but by dismemberment, that's the path. What we've been grappling with, what you've been grappling with both in the European Union and NATO, is really an effort to bridge ambiguities and to bridge political differences. So on the NATO hand, we'll say, yes, Georgia has a future in NATO, but we're reluctant to begin that process. Or the debate within the European Union now before the Eastern Partnership Summit is whether you can even say the association agreement isn't the final destiny. The point is that we actually can't tell these countries whether they're going to be in or out. Is that a more dangerous approach, the ambiguity of Western policy? Is our language not clear? Does it need to be a clear no or a clear yes to a perspective in the West for these nations?
Well, we can't be as clear as that because we would be breaching our own treaties. You know, the treaties of the European Union say that any European country can join provided they fulfill the criteria, and we just can't deny that. But look, I thought that after Bucharest, where I think you were there too, Steve, I thought the deal with Russia was the following. Effectively, in Bucharest, we denied membership action plans to both Ukraine and Georgia. So I thought the deal was that these countries will not be joining NATO, but that Russia would allow them to, and Russia even, I think, specifically said that at that time she didn't mind them edging towards European Union. So a little bit like Finland, say, military neutrality, economic integration with Europe, while Russia waits and makes up its mind whether she wants to join our world of rules or create her own alternative. And in the meantime, the rules of the games have changed. Now, even Eastern Partnership proved for President Putin too provocative. And that is hard to accept because, you know, Carl Bildt and myself, we proposed Eastern Partnership. And I don't see how Eastern Partnership can be provocative to anybody. In this town, someone coined the phrase, follow the money. So I just looked at what Eastern Partnership spends its money on. It's in the current European perspective, it's 4.1 billion euros on things like integrated border management, so as to make visa facilitation and visa abolition possible. SME facility, which is the strengthening of small and medium-sized enterprises. An initiative on civil defense and prevention of natural disasters, an initiative on regional energy markets and energy efficiency, the cooperation of ombudsman of Eastern Partnership, a civil administration, a cultural partnership, and there was also an anti-corruption training program. Now, I don't see how any of this stuff can be a geopolitical challenge to anybody.
You want to react to that, Steve?
You know, it's interesting, and it shows, I think, the problems. What happened in Bucharest was we had a huge dust-up over whether to give a membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine. In the end of the day, while the Americans pushed it, the Germans, the French defeated it. But, of course, the price of compromise is, while denying them a membership action plan, we adopted statements that made it very clear that the destination and the future of Georgia and Ukraine was to be a member of NATO. So in some sense, we gave the rhetorical provocation without the means of implementation of the vision. And probably was just exactly the wrong place to be. And I think the challenge that we all have to understand is that the way we've done business for the last 25 years with these very process-oriented, deliberate steps doesn't work in a time of strategic challenge. And we've got to rethink all of these issues. And, you know, quite frankly, difficult though it may be, if there is a time when Georgia should be in NATO, we should just put Georgia in NATO. Vote them in. Not a membership action plan, not a process that makes Georgia vulnerable in the movement towards accession. We're going to have to really rethink our processes and design them for the new strategic situation in which we find ourselves. I understand they will be excruciatingly difficult issues, but the times do not allow us to escape them.
So I hope that's going to provoke some good questions from our audience. But I want to, before I turn to the audience, I want to come back to how we think about the role of the United States in this effort. There are two things underway. We've convened this group, we've convened this conference because many of you know that Washington is very much in the middle of a rethink about its own strategy towards Russia, both in the administration and on Capitol Hill. And at the same time, the EU is headed towards an Eastern Partnership Summit in May. And what sort of happened after Bucharest is a recognition that, okay, the NATO agenda is now slowed. And the default became an EU process moving forward towards the Eastern Partnership, with the Americans sort of stepping back intentionally as the NATO agenda subsided. And so part of why we're here is we want to ensure that what's happening in terms of strategic thinking on one side of the Atlantic, that we're syncing it up on both sides. And the issue is, what is the role of the United States as we think about the East? Whether it's the Eastern Partnership itself or, more importantly, the broader strategy. We've been wanting to hand this baton off to Europe and say the Eastern Partnership is your game. That's the best game in town right now, and potentially take a back seat. How do you see the role of the United States in sorting out where we're going with Eastern policy now?
Well, the question was asked in the previous panel, namely, what's the US interest in all this? Well, I think US interest in it is credibility. First of all, because the US was a signatory of the Budapest Declaration. Ukraine gave up, I think it was at the time, the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world in return for a guarantee of its independence and inviolability of its borders. And I think it's a terrible signal to Iran or to North Korea that you cannot trust an undertaking when you give up your nuclear ambitions. That's number one. And number two, I believe that US formal allies and friends, not just in Europe, but all over the globe, are watching what happens in Europe and this challenge to the world of rules. And if the United States doesn't provide leadership in Europe, there will be consequences in Asia as well. Because when you are weaker, you have two options. You can trust your more powerful ally, or you accommodate whoever you perceive as a threat. So it's really a question about whether or not the United States still wants to be the underpinning of the post-war settlement and of the world of rules.
That's a significant point, Steve. I want to put it to you. Craig asked that question because we spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and the question actually is, yes, we are worried about Iran, North Korea, ISIS, and so it is a difficulty with assessing what are American interests and relative priority. You're connecting those two. How do you answer that question, Steve?
Well, I would say that a Europe whole, free, and at peace in which Russia finds its peaceful place is an overriding U.S. objective. It has been for 50 years. We have been a partner of Europe in that project. It is still very important to the interests of the United States and the peace of the world. I think Radek said it all. When Russia looked like it was on gradual convergence to the kind of European order that we all thought everyone had agreed on at the end of the Cold War, then for the United States to step back, take the NATO issues off the table, work the European integration through the EU, the Eastern Partnership, and let Europeans have the lead, made great sense. But I think Radek is right. Something has changed. Russian policy has changed. And in light of that new setting, I don't think Europe is strong enough to be left alone to deal with the Russia challenge without the United States. And that's one of the reasons Lavrov would like the United States to take a back seat as he deals with the problems in Europe.
Terrific. We've got a lot of grist on the up here right now. I want to turn to the audience for some comments, questions, and just remind all of you that are following online as well as here to continue using the hashtag ACEurope, ACEurope. So let me take, please, the first question here, and others just please catch my eye and I'll call on you.
Thanks, Damon. Chuck Berry, National Defense University. I wonder if you, both the panelists, would comment on what we've heard about Putin's sense of humiliation in the at the end of the Cold War, the demise of the Soviet Union, demise of the Warsaw Pact, and maybe his desire to right that wrong and maybe have a larger place in Russian history as a great leader.
Terrific. You want to pick that up, Radek?
I'm sure it's real enough. It's never easy to lose an empire. And you know, there are the representatives here of countries that have gone through that process. And it's particularly hard when it's contiguous rather than overseas. But there was an alternative, which, if you read Prime Minister Putin, the first Prime Minister Putin's program article, was a very good program of compensating the loss of empire with a thorough modernization of Russian state and society, in which Russia would gain respect of the world through its culture, through its technological prowess, through the strength of its civil society, and so on. There was an alternative. And you know, neighbors of Russia, such as Poland, fervently wish for that alternative to be tried again. But loss of empire is something that countries just have to adjust to eventually.
Let me pick up Bruce Jackson, please, a microphone here in the front. On the other side, Bruce, please. And please, everyone, introduce yourselves for our online audience as well.
Bruce Jackson, Project on Transitional Democracy. I just want to push Steve and Radek a little more about this response. Steve, you were arguing that the process has become dysfunctional, as it appears to be in the Balkans today, and has not reached the Nordics in any kind of conversation. So I understand the incentive to basically shorten that or make it more efficient. On the other hand, at about the time of Bucharest, there was a lot of criticism coming from Europe that we were going too fast, that we didn't look carefully enough at Romania and Bulgaria, and we made certain promises. And today we have processes that have extended into IMF, which also has conditionality. And we can't go to the American people and say we didn't check the due diligence on these countries. So how do you reconcile those two competing poles?
I don't want to make it more efficient. I don't want to necessarily make it more fast. I want to make it more strategic. I don't want it to be on autopilot, and I don't want it to be driven by meeting technical criteria. I think we need to step back, look at the challenge we face in Europe, and ask ourselves, what are the complex of measures? What is our objective, and what are the complex of measures that are going to get us there? And so what I'm asking for is a rethinking of how we do these issues in terms of NATO. I mean, I made this point to be provocative about Georgia, but it's an example of how we need to look at how we do our business in a more strategic way, reflecting the fact that we are in a new place than where we were just a few years ago.
Let me pick up two questions, if I might. I'll turn to Ariel and Paul, please. Standing over there, yes, please.
Good morning, Ariel Cohen, Center for Energy, Natural Resources, and Geopolitics. Radek, good to see you. Professor, Dr. Hadley.
Just Steve.
Question about a comprehensive strategy along the lines that Steve Hadley started talking about. We relied on a Pacific strategy in Europe. The administration is still in the process of military budget cuts and downgrading forces in Europe. What is the posture and what are the other non-military directions in this new strategy that Steve Hadley is talking about? Economic, information, soft power, hybrid, you name it. Thank you.
Ariel. Let me pick up Paul Grodd as well at the same time, if I might, and bring two questions back to our panelists.
Thank you. Paul Grodd, Ukrainian World Congress. More of a question to Radek, but also would like to hear Steve's comments on it as well. Question regarding regional security compositions. We're talking often about NATO being involved, assisting in Ukraine today. What's being done and what do you think should be done from a regional perspective rather than on just simply waiting on the United States to come in or Western European countries to come in? Isn't it what's happening on the Eastern European front in terms of those countries, including Ukraine, coming together in more of a bloc to support each other from a security perspective?
Why don't we start with you, Radek, and then we'll come to Steve.
First of all, let me answer a question. I'm not sure it was explicit, but implicit, namely, is there anything that we could do that would satisfy President Putin and bring him back to the convergence course, in particular on Ukraine? Now, I understand that proposals have already been made on guarantees that Ukraine would not, in fact, in any foreseeable future, become a member of NATO. There's been talk about a proposal at Davos of proposing to Russia a dialogue between the European Union and possibly the future TTIP and the Euro-Asiatic Union on creating a Northern Hemisphere free trade area. And that is also insufficient, which leads me to suspect that President Putin has not yet given up on trying to influence all of Ukraine. Because I think the frozen conflict is one possibility, as you say, of just making it more difficult for Ukraine to modernize itself. But I remember the February last year negotiations that led to the escape, the fleeing of President Yanukovych, and the Russian side were very clearly, even then, articulating the desire to see Ukraine as a federal state. And in the last few days, they also say that this is an internal Ukrainian conflict, and Kiev has to start talking to the separatists. And so I think the idea is to create the kind of constitution that would give a part some influence, possibly control, over the geopolitical orientation of the whole, on the model of what's been proposed for Transnistria, or on the model of what's actually in place in Bosnia. And that, of course, can be, it's not for us to decide, it's for the Ukrainians to decide, but it could be a model that makes the country ungovernable and very difficult to modernize. Ukrainian leadership has a very difficult conundrum. Now, what can we do? In Central Europe, I don't think any government will adopt, shall we say, a brave approach to this conflict without the United States first providing leadership. Because we are just too close. The price that we would pay of Russian reaction it would be too immediate and all too real. What we can do broadly as the West, I would put under three points. First, follow the money. We have allowed our institutions, our companies, our financial markets to be heavily influenced by Russian investments. Many of them for the good, but some of them politically motivated. Second, energy. There's nothing wrong with Russia benefiting from what God gave her, which is plentiful oil and gas. But we would prefer to get a better deal, a more market deal, rather than have politically motivated deals with either monopoly pricing or with political strings attached. And on this front, a lot of good is happening. Every year, the market for energy in Europe is more interconnected and more competitive. Lithuania has just built an LNG terminal. We are opening one next year. Interconnectors between Germany and Poland, between Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia. We could, for example, impose the rule that payments for the gas the legal point of payment is on the border of the EU. So once it's delivered, the gas, doesn't matter where it comes from, can be traded freely and delivered to where it's needed. And here the European Commission has a key and powerful role to play. And then the third is the media, which are a strategic resource for Russia. And we just... they are way ahead of us in using social media, in using state propaganda to affect our media space without us affecting their media space.
Mm-hmm. You've just continued to flesh out that strategy. Steve, do you want to pick up on the underlying issue that Paul was asking? I think in the absence of difficulty with NATO or EU decisions, is there more that can be done regionally around Ukraine, or even bilaterally with the U.S., or do you have to stay focused in that NATO-EU context in working with Ukraine?
This is a little out of my depth. I think there are a lot of people in subsequent panels can answer this. Obviously, the greater solidarity and cooperation there are among the states on the east, the better. And I think we want to have a multiplicity of relations. But I just would say three things. One, terms of the defense cuts, I would stop the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Europe. And I would also get out of this sequester and stop the cuts in the defense budget. I think it sends a good message. Secondly, there are other things, and Radek, has hit them, a different financial arrangement, a different energy policy that reduces over time Europe's dependence on Russia. The TTIP, getting that forward to show that Europe and the United States are going to be tied together in a sphere of prosperity. But on all of these things, I would keep the door open for Russia to participate when Russia decides to give up this effort to reestablish some kind of Russian empire and go back to the course that we thought they were going to pursue at the end of the Cold War. Because again, the goal of this is to deter Russia, but not to re-divide Europe. And I think that is possible, but it is going to require both a tougher policy while keeping the door open.
Thank you. Let me turn to two people who've actually had careers working on this set of issues for a while, to our guest from Helsinki, this former State Secretary, Risto, and I think Michael Lee is you as well, please.
Thank you very much for these remarks. Ukraine has been mentioned, and also Central Europe has been mentioned, but also the Baltics and the Nordics have been mentioned here. Normally we forget something very important, that already in 1997, President Clinton and Yeltsin, they agreed about the Baltic Sea area, how the security should be organized. Because it was President Yeltsin who accepted that the Baltic countries could be NATO members. So don't you think that we should underline that these problems, what we have in Southern Europe, in Central Europe, have been solved between the major players, us in the Nordics, Baltics, and NATO, United States, and Russia in the Northern Europe. And we should strengthen the stability based on that, rather than forgetting or putting old problems on the agenda, which has been solved on the basis of the Great Power Agreement.
Thank you very much, Risto. And let me turn to Michael Lee, who's been at the forefront of EU policy in this region.
Thanks very much, Damon. A question for Radek. Russian behavior in Ukraine is so unacceptable that any critical look at ourselves and our own policies sometimes is treated as a justification in some sense for what's going on. And yet the EU has launched a major re-examination of the neighborhood policy. Looking back now, what do you think in terms of the architecture of the Eastern Partnership and the tactics that we followed before and after Vilnius? Should we rethink this in a more fundamental way? Are DCFTAs really the right instrument for countries? I mean, Ukraine, quite apart from any political considerations, GNP per capita is only slightly above Bolivia. These countries are, in some sense, developing countries. Is this the right instrument? And can we find a way for member states and EU institutions to speak with one voice? On the whole, the EU institutions have been delegated by the member states to give values lessons to these countries, while the member states have pretty much got on with business as usual. And even today on the sanctions debate, we see traces of that. So what would you like to see coming out of this review of the neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership in particular?
Would you like to start with that one? Thank you.
Sure. Well, look, Europe has two neighborhoods, Eastern and Southern. Actually, 2/3 of the money for neighborhood goes to the South, where the Barcelona process has been in place for 15 years, but has achieved nothing like what Eastern Partnership has achieved in 5 years. So despite everything, I still believe that it's in the East that Europe can succeed, because these are European neighbors rather than neighbors of Europe. And I think DCFTA was the right approach. Because, first of all, free trade is not directed against anybody. And remember what the original offer to Russia was. First of all, Russia was invited to join Eastern Partnership. Russia herself said, no, we will not become members of Eastern Partnership because we are a strategic partner of Europe rather than a member of the neighborhood policy. That was Russia's choice. And we actually very consciously set up an exchange of information mechanism between the Commission and Russia so that Russia was informed about the doings of Eastern Partnership on a month-by-month basis. There were no surprises, no underhand dealings. And secondly, we've done a number of studies of the impact of DCFTA on the countries accepting it. And what was clear, and at the expert level, our Russian partners accepted it. Namely, that not only will DCFTAs be advantageous for the countries signing them, they would be advantageous for Russia in economic terms. But of course, the price of that was accepting a European legal system in those countries. I think, you know, at the time when Poland was going through this process, this was seen as an advantage. In addition, remember that when Russian companies export to the EU, they have to respect this regime of European technical norms and other criteria anyway. So this is a purely imaginary problem for Russia. Russia would benefit, and Russian companies have an interest in adopting European rules. I think the core of the problem is political and not even a matter of national interest, but national, if you like, honor. You know, who is setting the rules? Is it the European Union, or do we create our own set of rules and create our own equivalent organization that seeks parity? And the question is, can Russia carry off such a project? The Soviet Union didn't manage. And the jury is out.
And Steve, if I might, I think our Finnish colleague's question was hitting at a real concern about could this crisis spread into the Nordic-Baltic region. And even in your opening, you implied the concern that the target may not just be Ukraine. Would you speak to your concern about the potential for testing, probing in a crisis that could extend beyond Ukraine?
Yeah, part of it is your sense of who Vladimir Putin is and how he works. And I have my own, may be wrong. It's heavily based on the time when I was in government. I don't see him as a master strategist. I do see him as a very shrewd opportunist who takes advantage of situations. I think you saw that in Georgia in 2008, where he exploited Saakashvili. I think you saw it in terms of Ukraine, where he exploited the Maidan and you know, grabbed Crimea. So I think he's very opportunistic, and his objectives may grow depending on whether he's succeeding and whether he faces resistance and whether the costs begin to outweigh the strategic benefits. I think that's how he operates, and he will respond to that. So I think, you know, if he succeeds and is not resisted, there's not much that isn't potentially on the table in terms of Russian policy, which is why it's so important that we focus seriously and reset the rules of the game in Ukraine so that Putin decides that this game is not worth it. I think one thing that's come from this conversation is there are a lot of ideas for how to resolve Ukraine in a way that I think meets Russian interests. There are a lot of ways the EU has come up with to try to pursue its Eastern project in a way that takes into account Russian sensibilities. Russia is not yet in the position to accept those it at this point is not in a position and does not feel it needs to accept a deal in Ukraine because it does not feel it is going to not achieve its overall objectives. And that's where we have to get Russia to. There are lots of ideas about how to resolve this. The problem is the parties have to be willing, in this case, Russia has to be willing to accept a resolution.
So I know we've got more questions out, but I'm going to try to keep us on track. So I'm going to just very, very quickly, Grigory will close with your comment, and George, just a very brief comment if you wanted, please, very quickly, and then we'll wrap up right in the front. Microphone, please, yes.
Just one comment, and probably somebody would answer this. There is an elephant in this room that has not been yet mentioned, which is China. So when we observed when Russia, and as far as energy issue is concerned, when it was met with a tougher than expected response from the EU side, China came in as an alternative, or real or imagined one. So the issue is whether China still can sit back and allow Russia to compensate what they lost after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then China would gain after the breakup of the Soviet Union sense of the enhanced security and geostrategic gains. What do you think China's approach to the Ukrainian conflict is, and its implications for China's view on the world?
Thank you, Grigory, former Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. And a final question over here, please, to George Shapivsky. And this is going to be our speed round to close off the conversation. So thank you, George.
Thank you very much for the unexpected invitation. I'd like to start by saying to the panel that it's extremely refreshing to see a very new, realistic look at the situation in Europe and pertaining to Ukraine. I think this is very healthy. I welcome the observations made that we need to start a program, an expansive program of proactive measures, that we need to be realistic about looking at the situation, realistic in terms of assessing Putin and his ambitions. I think you hit the head here on what the problem is, and that is understanding exactly what Russia's and Putin's goals are. I think you have demonstrated the beginnings of that understanding. I'm not sure that that understanding is spread broadly throughout the decision-making community in Europe and in the United States. So my question would be, how do you then expand this understanding of the fact that we've got a clash of civilizations at this point? Radek, you said we don't understand each other's language, we don't understand each other's goals. I think we need to get to that understanding and then create realistic policies. How do we expand this understanding of what Russia is really about, what they really want, and how they really act, and then create our policies accordingly, not trying to accommodate them, but looking after our interests first of all.
Terrific. Thank you very much. George from an Atlantic Council Board Director. So final response to those last two questions. Any final thoughts, please?
Well, I'll leave China to Stephen, but but as regards understanding, I'm actually more optimistic than that. When I talk to U.S. officials, whether the State Department or the Pentagon, or in particular the U.S. Army in Europe, there's perfect understanding of what's going on. What is still lacking is decisions to do something about it.
Hence, that's why we are perhaps here today as well, to help inform that. I hope that's not Europe's tendency to hand China off to the United States, but Steve, a final comment.
We need a common strategy between the United States and Europe, and these forums are very useful, and those of you from the region coming and expressing candidly your views is an essential element of us developing that strategy. China, I think, is watching Ukraine. I worry that we have a new model of great power relations that looks a little different from what sometimes the United States and China talks about. I think, Putin is having a conversation with Xi Jinping that goes like this. You need to understand that the Americans are the enemy, that it does not that America does not accept the legitimacy of either of our countries' systems, political systems, and wants to change them. And that's what Ukraine was all about in terms of Russia, and that's what Hong Kong was all about with respect to China. So you need to understand that the United States is the enemy. The United States needs to be confronted, and the United States' allies in our societies need to be suppressed. Free media, political activists, NGOs, civil society. I think that conversation, quite frankly, is going on implicitly and explicitly. And, you know, we have to understand that we now we're in a new ideological competition. And we have ISIS and the Islamic State, which has a radical totalitarian vision that is a competitor and has resonance in the Middle East. We have this authoritarian state capitalism model that I think you're seeing in Russia and China. And our own democratic model looks a little bit long in the tooth. We are having economic problems. We seem to have political problems getting things through our systems. So, you know, we are now, who would have thought, 25 years after the end of the Cold War, we're back in an ideological struggle about what are the fundamental premises on which the world order is going to be based going forward. And we need to pull up our socks, work together, develop a common strategy, recognize that that's the game that's on, and get after it.
Thank you very much. I think that underscores what we wanted to get out of this conversation to kick off the conference, mapping the strategic landscape. I'm going to hand the baton shortly to Paolo Dobriansky, Atlantic Council Board Director, for the next panel with a fantastic lineup of ministers, officials, voices from the region. We'll take a 15-minute coffee break, but first let me just thank our two guests, our two speakers, Minister Sikorski, who is at the heart of the creation of the Eastern Partnership, Steve Hadley, who is one of the first voices helping to define the future of NATO enlargement in partnership with Russia. I think you've demonstrated why we wanted to have you here as part of this conversation as we think about the strategy going forward. Please join me in thanking them. Really appreciate your time. That was fantastic.